Imagine waking up one day and realizing that every argument you've ever had, every misunderstanding, every slow erosion of closeness between you and another person may not have been about them at all. It may have been about you, or more precisely, about a hidden part of you that you've refused to acknowledge. Picture a lover's face contorted in frustration, a friend's eyes clouded with sudden distance, a colleague's cold retreat after an offhand comment you barely registered. In each of these moments you thought you were acting from clarity, honesty, or even kindness, yet something beneath the surface was silently steering you. This something, this secret, unclaimed region of the psyche, acts like a puppeteer pulling invisible strings, shaping how you perceive, how you react, and how you wound the very people you care about. Carl Jung called it the shadow, and he warned that what we refuse to see in ourselves does not disappear. It grows powerful in the dark, and eventually it leaks out, distorting our relationships like a hidden toxin in clear water. You tell yourself you're a patient person, yet you explode at trivial provocations. You pride yourself on being loyal, yet you push away those who get too close. You think you're open-minded, yet certain people evoke an irrational contempt you can't explain. Why? What if these contradictions are not random but signs of a deeper fracture between the self you present and the self you've buried? What if the very qualities you despise in others are the disowned parts of yourself, wearing someone else's face so you don't have to look directly at your own? If so, how many of your relationships are built not on authentic connection, but on a stage of projections, where you act out a drama written by a self you've never truly met? It's unsettling to consider that intimacy may not be what we think it is. We imagine closeness as two transparent beings meeting without masks. But what if closeness is instead a collision of unconscious forces, each person projecting their hidden fears, envies, and suppressed desires onto the other? We think we're seeing the other clearly, but perhaps we're looking at a mirror, distorted by the shadows of our own psyche. How much of your partner's flaws are really yours in disguise? How much of your friend's failings are shadows you've outsourced to them so you can remain pure in your own eyes? And if the shadow is indeed orchestrating these unseen exchanges, is any relationship truly honest? Or are we all sleepwalking through a masquerade we mistake for love? You may wonder if this is just another psychological metaphor, an elegant but abstract idea. But what if it's not? Consider how quickly admiration can turn to resentment when someone's success activates your own buried feelings of inadequacy. Notice how a trivial mistake by a partner can trigger disproportionate rage, not because of the mistake itself, but because it echoes some old humiliation you never faced. These are not accidents. They are the shadow's fingerprints, clues that what we repress does not stay silent, but speaks in the language of our emotions, our reactions, and our relationships. Jung warned, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." How much of what you call bad luck in relationships is actually your shadow at work? This is the paradox. The parts of ourselves we most fear, the selfishness, the envy, the rage, the vulnerability, are the very parts most capable of sabotaging our connections when left unacknowledged. We believe repression protects our relationships from our worst impulses, yet repression may be precisely what ensures those impulses burst out at the worst times, in the most damaging ways. Could it be that the greatest threat to your bonds with others is not their flaws, but your refusal to meet the hidden self inside you? And if so, how do you begin to look into that dark mirror without being destroyed by what you see? As you sit with these questions, you may feel a quiet dread, a sense that something crucial has been operating behind your life's most painful patterns. This is not paranoia. It is the beginning of sight. For once you glimpse the shadow's outline, you can no longer pretend it isn't there. But awareness alone is not enough. Like a creature drawn out of a cave, the shadow resists the light. The next step is to understand where it comes from, why it exists, and why it is so determined to shape your relationships from the dark. Only then can you begin to free yourself from its grip. And so, the real journey begins, not outward, but inward. Into the origins of the shadow, its psychological and philosophical roots, and its quiet power to shape the bonds you thought you were freely choosing. The question now is not just what is the shadow, but why does it exist at all? and why does it care so much about the people you love? Trace the shadow back to its beginnings and you find yourself at a strange crossroads between psychology, culture, and philosophy. From the moment you were born, a silent education began, one not in words but in glances, tone, and consequences. When you reached for something and were told no, when you expressed an emotion and saw disapproval flicker across a caregiver's face, when you felt impulses you could not explain and were met with shame, a subtle line was drawn inside you between what was acceptable and what was not. Over time, that line hardened into a wall. On one side stood the self you were allowed to show, the mask that earned praise and safety. On the other side grew a collection of forbidden feelings, unapproved desires, unexpressed fears, a second self hidden from the world and eventually even from you. This is the genesis of the shadow, not as an abstract myth, but as an adaptation, a strategy for survival. Yet what begins as protection becomes imprisonment. Carl Jung saw this clearly. Unlike Freud, who focused on repressed sexuality and parental dynamics, Jung envisioned a broader psychic ecosystem. To him, the shadow was not just repressed instinct, but a living storehouse of everything the ego refuses to identify with. It contains not only what is bad, but also what is undeveloped, what is potent but unlived. Courage you've never dared, anger you've never owned, tenderness you've never expressed. He believed that by banishing these qualities to the unconscious, you don't erase them. You simply lose the ability to choose how they appear. They slip out in projections, compulsions, and accidents that shape your relationships more powerfully than your conscious intentions ever could. This is why he warned that what you most need will be found where you least want to look. Philosophers sensed this same dynamic long before Jung gave it a name. Friedrich Nietzsche, who wrote of the will to power and the abyss, warned that whoever fights monsters should see to it that he does not become a monster. He was speaking to the same mechanism. In resisting what you fear or hate, you risk becoming it unconsciously. Arthur Schopenhauer saw human life as driven by blind, irrational forces that mock our sense of being rational agents. Jean-Paul Sartre argued that most people live in bad faith, lying to themselves about who they are to avoid the nausea of freedom. All these thinkers converge on a single point. There is a part of you that you do not govern, that you would rather not see, but that nonetheless writes much of the script of your life. Modern psychology adds more detail to this ancient intuition. Cognitive science shows how we develop implicit biases, snap judgments, and emotional reactions we're not even aware we hold. Attachment theory explains how early relational patterns create unconscious templates for adult intimacy, so that you may keep replaying your childhood wounds in each new partner, friend, or colleague. Neuroscience reveals how emotions like shame and fear are processed in primitive parts of the brain, triggering fight, flight, or freeze before your rational mind can intervene. All of these findings echo Jung's insight. The unconscious is not a vague, mystical cloud, but a network of living processes that act faster than thought and can hijack your relationships before you know what's happening. What makes this problem so insidious is its invisibility. You don't see yourself projecting your shadow onto others, you just see people who seem untrustworthy, irritating, weak, or arrogant. You don't notice the moment you withdraw from intimacy, you just feel a vague loss of interest. You don't hear the echo of an old humiliation, you just feel a flash of disproportionate rage. Each time you think you're reacting to reality, but you're reacting to a ghost, your own disowned self reflected back at you through another person's face. This is why Jung called shadow integration the apprentice piece of personal growth. Until you see your shadow, you cannot see the other person clearly, and without that clarity, every relationship is haunted. Consider a simple example. A man prides himself on being calm and composed, yet he finds himself inexplicably irritated by a friend's emotional outbursts. He tells himself the friend is too dramatic, but the real irritation may be his own disowned vulnerability, the part of him that once wanted to cry, but learned to suppress it. The friend's emotions call to that buried part, and because he can't tolerate it in himself, he attacks it in another. Or imagine a woman who sees herself as endlessly giving, yet resents her partner's neediness. She may be projecting her own repressed hunger for care onto the partner, hating in them what she can't admit in herself. These are not isolated quirks, but patterns woven through all of human intimacy. This is where philosophy deepens psychology. If, as Sartre argued, we are condemned to freedom, then every time you blame someone else for your reactions, you're evading your own freedom to choose a different response. If, as Nietzsche insisted, the self is a multiplicity of drives, then your task is not to annihilate the shadow, but to orchestrate it, to become a conductor rather than a victim of your inner orchestra. Yet the culture you live in may discourage this. Western ideals of individualism, productivity, and positivity often reward repression. Don't show weakness, don't express rage, don't question norms. Social media amplifies this with curated images of perfection, pushing your disowned self even further underground. So the shadow persists, hidden but powerful. You may sense it as a vague unease, a pattern of failed relationships, a cycle of attraction and repulsion you can't explain. You may call it fate, bad luck, or just the way people are. But what if it's not them? What if the root of your relational suffering is not outside but inside, in a hidden split that began long before you met the people now caught in its orbit? This is the hidden problem. The shadow is not a personal flaw, but a structural feature of being human, born of the tension between the self you must present and the self you actually are. Recognizing this is unsettling, but also clarifying. It means your repeated disappointments are not meaningless. They are messages. Your conflicts are not accidents, they are invitations. Every irritation, every disproportionate reaction, every inexplicable withdrawal may be your shadow knocking, asking to be acknowledged. But acknowledging it is not the same as understanding how it operates. You still need to see the mechanisms, the projections, the cognitive biases, the conditioned scripts that let the shadow steer you. A life without your consent. Only then can you begin to sense how deeply this hidden force shapes not just your relationships, but the entire fabric of your reality. And this leads us to the next. Revelation. If the shadow is so deeply woven into perception, then its effects on your life are far greater than a few awkward arguments or breakups. It may be silently scripting the entire story you think you're living. To see that, we must step further into the dark, not just to trace the shadow's roots, but to witness its unseen consequences, the ways it shapes your world while convincing you it is not there at all. Imagine walking through a hall of mirrors where every surface subtly warps your reflection. Some stretch your features into grotesque shapes, others shrink or blur you, yet you never notice because you've never seen a true reflection. This is the psychological hall you inhabit when your shadow runs unchecked. Every person you meet becomes a reflective surface not of who they are, but of what you cannot accept in yourself. Over time, your life becomes a labyrinth of distorted perceptions, invisible scripts, and self-fulfilling prophecies. You think you're living in reality, you're actually living inside your own projections. The unseen consequence is not merely a string of failed relationships, but an entire worldview shaped by hidden parts of yourself, an internal exile that turns the outside world into a stage for your unconscious drama. Take the subtle ways this plays out. You feel a flash of envy at a friend's success, but rather than name it, you call them arrogant. You withdraw from a partner who wants more closeness, telling yourself they're too needy while ignoring the part of you that's terrified of being known. You bristle at criticism because it awakens an old wound of inadequacy you've never soothed, yet you frame it as, they're disrespectful. These are not isolated slips. They are the shadow scripting your emotional reality. Over years, these misattributions harden into patterns. You come to believe certain people are always untrustworthy, CE, certain situations always humiliating, certain emotions always dangerous. Your nervous system, primed by past repression, becomes a hypersensitive radar for triggers that confirm your unconscious beliefs. Neuroscientists call this predictive coding. Your brain constantly anticipates the world, filling in gaps with its own assumptions. When your assumptions are shaped by a disowned self, you literally hallucinate threat, betrayal, or contempt where there may be none. Now magnify this at the social scale. Whole cultures develop collective shadows, qualities they deny in themselves and project onto outsiders. History overflows with examples: moral crusades that mask hidden corruption, puritanical movements erupting into scandal, xenophobia that reflects unacknowledged fears at home. Jung, writing in the shadow of 2 world wars, warned that when masses of individuals refuse to face their inner darkness, it accumulates in the collective unconscious and erupts as political extremism, scapegoating, even genocide. This is why he insisted that the fate of humanity depends on the individual's willingness to confront their own shadow. The change must begin with the individual. Only the enlightened individual can enlighten the mass. The unseen consequence of ignoring your shadow is not just personal suffering, but participation in larger patterns of violence, prejudice, and division you may consciously oppose, but unconsciously reinforce. Closer to home, the shadow erodes intimacy from the inside. True connection requires vulnerability, but vulnerability threatens the ego's carefully curated image. So you wear masks, competence, generosity, charm, and resent others for not seeing the real you, even as you hide it. Partners become adversaries in a quiet, cold war of projections. Friends become mirrors for your self-loathing. You misread signals, overreact to minor slights, withdraws. At the first hint of discomfort. Over time, trust frays. You may blame modern relationships or people these days, but beneath the sociological noise is a psychological constant. You cannot receive what you will not allow yourself to feel. Until you reclaim your disowned anger, your suppressed tenderness, your unacknowledged fears. Every relationship is built on half a self, trying to bond with another half. This creates a peculiar double bind. On the surface, you long for closeness. Beneath it, you sabotage it. You want to be understood, but fear exposure. You crave admiration, but resent those who have it. You seek freedom, but choose partners who recreate your childhood cage. The result is a cycle of attraction and repulsion you cannot explain. Each breakup, each falling out, each career clash seems to confirm your story. People always let me down. Love never lasts. I can't trust anyone. But in reality, you're confirming the shadow's story, replaying an old wound in a new scene. Viktor Frankl, who survived the camps and still spoke of meaning, wrote that between stimulus and response there is a space, and in that space lies our freedom. The shadow closes that space. It floods you with emotion before you can choose, and you call it destiny. Even when you achieve what you thought you wanted, the shadow can hollow it out. You land the job, but feel inexplicably dissatisfied. You marry the partner, but find yourself restless or critical. You build the persona, but sense a gnawing emptiness behind it. Jung observed that unlived life accumulates like pressure, producing midlife crises, sudden breakdowns, compulsive affairs, or addictions, not because life is cruel, but because the disowned self will not be silenced forever. What you repress seeks expression, and if you won't give it a conscious voice, it will erupt as symptom, sabotage, or projection. Cognitive biases intensify this trap. Confirmation bias makes you notice only evidence that supports your unconscious narrative about people. The fundamental attribution error leads you to explain your own behavior by circumstances but others by character, fuel for shadow projections. The availability heuristic makes dramatic, emotionally charged memories more salient, so you overestimate betrayal and underestimate loyalty. These mental shortcuts evolved to help us survive, but under the shadow's influence, they become chains, locking you into a distorted social reality. The most chilling consequence is how normal it feels. Because you've always lived inside this hall of mirrors, its distortions seem like truth. You may even take pride in your cynicism, thinking you see the world as it really is, unaware that you're seeing it through the lens of your disowned self. Like Plato's prisoners mistaking shadows on the cave wall for reality, you're convinced your projections are other people's flaws. And because the shadow hides behind your conscious identity, it resists exposure. When someone points out your pattern, you feel attacked, misunderstood. When life presents you with a person who mirrors your disowned self, you flee or fight rather than reflect. Thus the cycle sustains itself. The shadow creates pain, the pain deepens the shadow, and all the while you believe it's just how things are. Yet buried within this bleak picture is a strange opportunity. Every projection is also a breadcrumb. Every disproportionate reaction is a flare from the unconscious. Each person who irritates you beyond reason is a disguised teacher, showing you what you've disowned. If you can learn to see these signals without collapsing into shame, the same forces that once sabotaged your relationships can become guides toward wholeness. Jung called this shadow integration. Not a one-time revelation, but a lifelong practice of turning inward when you're most tempted to point outward. But the shadow will not yield easily. It is cunning, adaptive built from decades of reinforcement. To face it requires a rebellion against your own habits of perception, a willingness to question your most cherished self-image, a courage that feels like self-annihilation, but is actually self-liberation. The next step is to see what that rebellion looks like, to explore how ordinary people, philosophers, mystics, and even you can break free from the unseen scripts and reclaim the power you've unknowingly ceded to the dark. Picture yourself at a crossroads where every familiar road leads back into the same loop of patterns, arguments, disappointments, that sense of déjà vu in your relationships. You've begun to suspect the common denominator isn't them, it's you. But here's the paradox. The very self that has been shaped by the shadow is the one trying to free itself. This is why shadow work feels at first like treason against your own identity. To rebel against the shadow, you must rebel against the comfort of your self-image, against the protective stories you've told about who you are and why others are at fault. This rebellion is not loud or dramatic. It's quiet, interior, and radical. It starts the moment you stop running from your own reactions and turn toward them with ruthless curiosity. Jung never saw shadow integration as erasing darkness. He saw it as a marriage between the conscious and unconscious, a process of making a larger self out of fragments. This begins with awareness. When you feel a disproportionate emotion, anger, envy, contempt, attraction, pause before explaining it away. Ask, what is this showing me about myself? Rather than rehearsing the other person's flaws, trace the emotion back into your own history. Where did you first feel it? What part of you has been denied expression? This act of reflection creates a small gap between stimulus and response, a gap where freedom lives. It's not about blaming yourself for others' behavior. It's about reclaiming the power you've ceded to projections. Philosophically, this is an act of owning your freedom, as Sartre would put it. In bad faith, you pretend you're a victim of other people's flaws. In authenticity, you admit you're co-creating the interaction through your perceptions, expectations, and reactions. Nietzsche would call this becoming who you are, the difficult art of integrating all your drives rather than splitting into good and bad selves. Even Schopenhauer's grim view of blind will contains a hidden prescription. You can't kill the will, but you can understand its workings and stop being its puppet. In practice, this means accepting that everything you've disowned, your anger, selfishness, vulnerability, desire, is part of you and therefore can be brought into conscious choice instead of erupting unconsciously. Practical shadow work involves rituals of honesty, journaling when you're triggered, not about the other person but about the qualities in them that disturb you, examining your dreams, which Jung called the royal road to the unconscious, for images of neglected aspects of the self. Practicing active imagination, dialoguing on paper with a part of you you've disowned. Even simple mindfulness of bodily sensations can reveal the shadow's presence, the tightening jaw, the quickened heartbeat, the sudden urge to dismiss or attack. These are not inconveniences, they're messages. By meeting them with curiosity rather than suppression, you begin to drain the shadow's power. Historically, people who've undergone this rebellion describe it as both terrifying and liberating. Mystics spoke of the dark night of the soul, where all familiar consolations vanish so that a larger self can emerge. Marcus Aurelius, though a Stoic emperor, wrote private notes about examining his own reactions as if they were intruders to prevent being ruled by them. Modern psychotherapists describe patients who, once they own a repressed trait, say anger, suddenly stop sabotaging their marriages because they no longer need it to project that anger onto a spouse. Each case illustrates the same principle. What you integrate loses its power to control you. At the relational level, this rebellion transforms communication. Instead of accusing, "You're so selfish," you can own your projection. "I'm noticing I feel unseen. Is there a part of me that's denying my own needs?" Instead of fleeing intimacy when it stirs old fears, you can name the fear and stay present. This doesn't mean tolerating mistreatment. It means separating your shadow from the other person's behavior so you can respond proportionally. As you practice this, you'll notice something extraordinary. People start showing up differently around you. Because you're no longer unconsciously casting them in your inner drama, they're free to be who they are, and so are you. This rebellion also involves confronting collective shadows. When you catch yourself stereotyping a group, ask what disowned quality you're projecting. When you notice moral outrage, ask if it masks a similar impulse in you. This doesn't excuse injustice. It clarifies your vision so you can fight injustice without becoming its mirror. Jung warned that unintegrated shadows are contagious. Entire nations can project their darkness onto outsiders. Your individual integration, though invisible, contributes to collective sanity. A counterintuitive aspect of this process is that embracing your darkness often reveals hidden gold. Jung noted that the shadow contains not only primitive impulses, but undeveloped virtues. Courage you've mistaken for aggression, sensuality you've mistaken for shame, sensitivity you've mistaken for weakness. By integrating these, you don't become more dangerous, you become more whole. Relationships deepen because you're bringing your full self, not a mask. People sense this authenticity. They may at first be unsettled by your refusal to play old games, but they'll trust you more because you're no longer projecting or manipulating unconsciously. This is not a one-time breakthrough, but a lifelong discipline. Like learning a language, it ends clumsily, with mistakes, and gradually becomes second nature. Each time you catch a projection before it hardens into blame, you're practicing freedom. Each time you admit a disowned feeling before it turns into sabotage, you're reclaiming power. Each time you speak honestly about your inner state, you're inviting the other person to meet you in reality rather than illusion. Over time, this creates a new kind of intimacy, one based not on perfection, but on mutual shadow awareness. Breaking free also means letting go of perfectionism. You will never be without a shadow. Integration is not eradication. It's learning to dance with the dark rather than being dragged by it. This humility protects you from the most dangerous trap of all, believing you've transcended your shadow. The moment you think you're done, it slips back in through pride. So the rebellion is perpetual, a willingness to look inward, to own your freedom, to choose authenticity over projection again and again. And here is where the journey turns toward its deepest revelation. If the shadow is not merely an obstacle but also a teacher, if your projections are not just sabotage but signals, then confronting the shadow is not merely self-defense but self-discovery. The parts you feared might destroy you may be the very parts that complete you. To glimpse this is to sense an ultimate truth beyond blame and fear, a truth that redefines not only your relationships but your entire sense of reality. That is where we turn next, to the final, most powerful realization the shadow has been hiding all along. The final, most powerful realization. Imagine you've been walking through a forest at night, guided only by the dim glow of a lantern. Every tree seems like a threat, every rustle a predator, every shadow an enemy. You move cautiously, defending yourself from dangers that may or may not exist. Then, without warning, dawn breaks. The same forest floods with light. Trees become majestic instead of menacing. The rustles turn into birdsong, and the shadows dissolve into the shapes of branches and leaves. Nothing external has changed, only the light by which you see. This is what happens when you integrate your shadow. The ultimate truth is not that you must defeat your darkness, but that you must illuminate it, because in that light, what looked monstrous often reveals itself as misunderstood, unlived, or unloved parts of you. The paradox Jung points to, one echoed by mystics and philosophers across centuries, is that the self you've been fleeing is also the self you've been seeking. The anger you feared might destroy you becomes the backbone you needed to set boundaries. The vulnerability you buried under pride becomes the bridge to real intimacy. The envy you disowned becomes a map to your deepest desires. Integration transforms poison into medicine, not by magic, but by ownership. You no longer cast your darkness onto others, so they no longer appear as threats. You begin to meet people as they are, not as mirrors of your hidden self. This shift feels like waking from a dream you didn't know you were dreaming. At its deepest level, the shadow reveals that you are not a single, unified, permanent entity, but a constellation of drives, memories, and possibilities. The ego's story of being a stable, morally consistent self is a necessary fiction, but it's also a prison. By confronting the shadow, you see that you are larger than any single trait, impulse, or mask. This realization is frightening at first. Your identity feels porous, unstable, but then it's liberating. You're no longer compelled to defend an image. You can be honest, flexible, alive. Nietzsche called this amor fati, the love of one's fate. not as passive resignation, but as an active embrace of everything you are, including what you once called unacceptable. This redefine Yao as relationships at their core. No longer are they battlegrounds for projection or stages for reenacting old wounds. They become laboratories for mutual recognition. When you see your shadow, you also see the others. You stop demanding they carry your disowned parts. You can hold space for their humanity because you've made peace with your own. Conflict still happens, but it's cleaner, less entangled with hidden agendas. Love stops being a transaction of masks and becomes a meeting of souls, imperfect, raw, and therefore real. This doesn't guarantee every relationship will survive. Some will end, but even endings will be clearer, less poisoned by blame. You'll sense, often wordlessly, when something is no longer aligned without needing to vilify the other person. Philosophically, this is akin to waking up from Plato's cave. You turn from the shadows on the wall to the source of light itself. The light here is consciousness, the act of witnessing your own inner life without flinching. Viktor Frankl spoke of finding meaning even in suffering. Integrating your shadow is how you find meaning in your own contradictions. By seeing the hidden order of your psyche, you stop mistaking its effects for random chaos. Even pain becomes a teacher, a signal of where integration is needed. This doesn't make life painless, but it makes pain purposeful, which is a subtler and deeper form of freedom than mere comfort. Neuroscience supports this. Studies on mindfulness and self-compassion show that when people observe their emotions without judgment, the amygdala's threat response calms, the prefrontal cortex engages, and they gain greater control over impulses. This is the biological signature of shadow work. You're literally rewiring your nervous system to create space between trigger and reaction. Over time, you become less governed by unconscious patterns and more capable of deliberate choice. This is not self-improvement in the shallow sense. It's self-expansion, a growing capacity to hold your entire being without splitting it into